Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to make a basic apple crisp recipe. So this recipe uses apples with a few spices and then has a really nice crumble topping on top. If you don't have apples but you have some sort of other fruit, so this can usually be done with mixed berries or strawberries or any other sort of fruit. So you could also do this with peaches if you have those, or pears, and all those would be really nice ways of going about this. So this is kind of a fruit crisp recipe, but for today I'm just going to show you how to do it with apples. So here's our apple crisp recipe, and it is still very basic. We're going to start off with 6 gala apples. I have kind of small apples, so I'm going to use 7. But to that, we just need to add a few spices and a little bit of sugar to sweeten it up. So we have some brown sugar, some lemon juice. The lemon juice helps to prevent the apples from turning brown as I cut them up. And after that, we have some vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg, and then a 1/4 cup of cornstarch to help thicken it. Because as we cook the apples, it is going to draw out a lot of the moisture, so the cornstarch will help thicken it up. It'll create a nice sauce instead of it just being really watery on the bottom, right? And then underneath of that is the crumble. So that's just brown sugar, butter, flour, and oats. This crumble recipe is really good. If you use any other type of fruit, this crumble recipe is still going to be really good. Now, if you decide to use mixed berries instead of apples, I probably wouldn't put in cinnamon and nutmeg. It might taste a little bit odd, but the vanilla and lemon juice would still be a good addition to that. So it's up to you what you want to do, but apples are always a classic way to go for this recipe. Here I have all my ingredients together. Just remember, whenever you measure out brown sugar, you want to pack it into the measuring cup and then level it off. So it should maintain its shape just like this one. So here's my brown sugar, cornstarch, vanilla, nutmeg, cinnamon, and lemon juice. For this recipe, I'm using some Royal Gala apples that I have. There's a few different types of apples that you can use. Royal Galas work really well. Also, if you have Macintoshes or Granny Smiths, those are very good baking apples to use for this recipe as well. You just want to try and avoid using something like a Golden Delicious or a Red Delicious, because those apples tend to break down really easily when cooked. So instead of having chunks of apple, like cooked apple at the end, you're just going to have a pile of applesauce. So if you like that and you want it to be really soft, then I guess you can go that way, but this is probably the best way for you to go. My apples are actually a little bit old, which is fine with me. I find this is a really great way of getting rid of some extra apples that may have been kicking around for a while. But the preparation of the apples is probably the most labor-intensive part of this recipe. And it's just because you have to peel it, core it, and then cut them into chunks. Okay, so first thing, I'll just get rid of my little stem. And then you just have to go about peeling this whole thing. So using a peeler like this is probably the best way, or your best option. If you don't have one, you can always use a paring knife instead. It's just a little bit more difficult because you can see while I'm peeling, it's a very, very thin piece of apple that's coming off of there. And when people use paring knives, it's usually a little bit more difficult for them to try and slice it that thin. And you end up losing a little bit of apple in the peeling process. Okay, so once that's done, just set it down and try and cut it directly in half. Okay, so once you have that, you have your 2 halves. Set that down and then try and cut that in half as well. Okay, so I missed a little bit, but that's okay. So at this point, you want to get rid of this whole middle section because you don't want any of the seeds in there, and you also don't want this really tough bit either, okay, because that's not going to be really fun to chew on. So what you want to do, just carefully slice the ends off. So that's one. Cut this other end off as well. Okay, and then while you're holding this, you just want to cut a little V. So cut in here and then cut in here. Okay, so you can see I was able to cut out all of the tough parts in the middle. Now I just have to put that down. I'm going to cut this into 3 slices, turn, and then I'm going to cut that way. So I have 9 chunks. This is a pretty good size, so that once I cook it down, it should be about half the size, and that would be really good for me to be able to eat as a apple crisp. Okay, so I'm just gonna store those in my bowl and then do the rest of them. Okay, so if you're a little concerned about this kind of movement because the knife is a little bit close to your hand, just hold it down and you can cut this way instead. Okay, so cut that off, cut this off, right? And then while you're holding this, just carefully cut a little V, turn it, cut another V. Okay, and you're good. Right? So again, I was able to cut all of that hard stuff out, and then just cut it like normal. So it's up to you the way that you're comfortable with. If you're a little bit concerned about cutting yourself because you don't have a lot of experience using knives, I would recommend the method where you just hold it on the board and cut away from you. Okay, doing this will help to minimize your risk of cutting yourself. Okay, so you just have to cut very slowly so that you don't accidentally slip and then cut into your finger. Right, so this is what we're going to do with all the apples. So just peel and core and dice them up. Once your apples are all cut up, you can just start mixing in the rest of the stuff. So I have my lemon juice here. I'm going to mix that in first just because that's going to help the apples from browning any more than they already have. The acid on the surface helps to prevent the oxidation. Okay, so, oh, and before I forget, now that we've gotten through the longest part of the recipe, what you probably want to do now is preset your oven to 375 if you haven't already. So that's in. I'm going to add my 1 teaspoon of vanilla. Right, I like using the spatula just so I can get as much out as possible. Right, and then I'm going to mix in my brown sugar. Right, one of the things that you'll notice if you look at the bottom here, it's pretty dry. Right, there's not a lot of anything at the bottom. And once you start mixing sugar in, sugar is one of those things that attracts water molecules. So it'll actually draw moisture out of the apples, and you'll notice if this sits for a bit that it actually becomes a little bit wet on the bottom. Okay, so I'll just mix that in the best that you can. I think I'm actually going to go with a bigger bowl because this is getting a little difficult to mix. Put that in here. So you can see already there's some moisture coming out of the apples. Okay, and that should just increase as I keep mixing it. There, that's easier. Okay, so then I have my 2 spices. So here's my tablespoon of cinnamon. And my half a teaspoon of nutmeg. Okay, again, nutmeg is one of those spices that's pretty flavorful and strong, so half a teaspoon is all you need. So I'm going to mix those together as well. And I'm just going to let this mix and sit for a little bit before I add the cornstarch. Okay, I want this to be a little bit wet because then it's a little bit easier to mix the cornstarch in. So as you're doing this, if you wanted to, you could add a little bit of ginger powder or like grated ginger if you like that sort of thing. You can add a little bit of cloves in as well. Those are all spices that are going to work well with the apples. Okay, so as I was saying before, you can see now that it's actually quite wet if you consider that everything we put in here was dry. Okay, so it's starting to draw the moisture out. So this is a good point for me to start putting in the cornstarch. Okay, so I have a 1/4 cup of that. And just mix that in. Just want to make sure that everything is coated well. Okay. And cornstarch mixes in really well with water, so you can see that it's dissolving pretty easily. So now I'm just going to select a container to put it in. Based off of the amount of apples, I'm going to use my 9x13 pan. If you have some other kind of baking dish, go ahead and use that. It doesn't really matter too much. You're going to cook down the apples, and then the crumble on top will crisp up as you're cooking the apples. Okay. This is a recipe I don't have to put anything on the bottom, so I don't need any parchment paper. I don't have to spray it or anything. The apples won't stick. Okay, so I'm just gonna put those in and then even it out. Okay, and try and use a spatula to get as much of the liquid out as possible. Okay. Alright, so just have to even this out. Okay. So it should be okay to sit for a little bit while we make the crumble. The crumble recipe is actually pretty simple. There's only the 4 ingredients, so you need half a cup of butter, half a cup of brown sugar, 3/4 of a cup of quick oats, and then 3/4 of a cup of flour. So I'm just going to throw my butter in. So I actually had half a cup left, which was perfect. Okay, got my half a cup of brown sugar, nice and packed in. And then I just have to measure out 3/4 of a cup of oats, and then flour. Okay, if you're a little bit over or under, it's fine. It doesn't really matter. So there's my oats. Actually, see, I don't have a lot left, so I'm just gonna put the rest in. It'll just be a little bit oaty. And then I need my flour. 3/4 of a cup of that. And all I'm going to do is mix this by hand. So if you had a food processor, you could probably throw it all together and just let it chop itself up, and then you should get to the right texture. For me, I like being able to control the size of the chunks of butter. Okay, so mix all these guys, just coat my butter a little bit. And then, just like with the tea biscuits, you can chop it up into some small pieces if you want, or you can just start breaking it. Okay, so we want to break these down into pieces that are about the size of a hazelnut or a pea, exactly like what you did with the biscuits. And then we're just going to put that on the top of the apple crisp. Here's the crumble. It's at a nice texture. If you go through it, you can see that everything's crumbled up pretty well. There's some fairly large chunks of butter, which is alright. The butter is going to mix in with all the other ingredients, so it's going to cook down and have a really nice crunchy topping. So all I have to do is grab my apples and then evenly distribute this onto the top. Right, this actually makes quite a lot of crumble, but you can save some of it for later if you want. If you're planning on making muffins or something like that that would work well with a crumble topping, you can just save some and put that on the top. For me, I'm just going to use up the whole thing. There we go. Okay, so I'll make sure this is nice and coated. And once your oven is up to temperature, you can put that in. So I'm going to leave this for about half an hour in the oven, and then I'll check on it. It's been about half an hour since I put it into the oven. It's starting to brown up pretty nicely. I feel like it's not quite done yet. Usually when it gets to the point that it's ready to come out of the oven, you'll see some of the apple, I don't know, I guess we'll call it sauce. The thickened liquid should be bubbling on the sides, and that's how you know that it's done. So I'll put it back in for another 10 minutes. And we're all done. So I gave it another 10 minutes. The top is a really nice golden brown, and I also saw the sides bubbling a little bit just before I took it out. So if we crack into this a little bit, this is nice and cooked on the bottom. It got a little bit dried out, so it's probably because my apples were a little bit old and were lacking some liquid. So if you have some fresh juicy apples, you'll probably have a really nice sauce that comes out of yours.